Welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling deep into the heart of Russia, to a story so devastating, so utterly heartbreaking, that it will change how you think about the supernatural forever. This isn't just another ghost story. This is the story of innocence destroyed, of children who never had a chance to grow up, and of a house that became the final chapter in one of history's most tragic dynasties. The location? A seemingly ordinary mansion in Yekaterinburg, Russia. The time? July 1918. What happened there was so brutal, so unthinkable, that for nearly 70 years the Soviet government kept it buried as a state secret. But secrets this dark have a way of clawing their way back to the surface, don't they? They say that when children die violently, their spirits never truly rest. They linger, trapped between worlds, searching for the peace they were never allowed to find in life. And in this case, we're talking about 4 young girls and a 13-year-old boy whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time in history. The house I'm talking about is the Ipatiev house, though locals knew it by another name. The House of Special Purpose. Special purpose. What a chilling euphemism for what was essentially a death row for Russia's imperial children. Built in the 1880s as a wealthy merchant's home, this 2-story mansion with its 31-meter facade would become the site of one of the most horrific family murders in modern history. Here's what makes this story so particularly haunting. These weren't just any children. These were the Romanov children: Olga, 22, Tatiana, 21, Maria, 19, Anastasia, 17, and little Alexei, just 13 years old. They were Russia's imperial family, descendants of a dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years. But by 1918, they were just frightened kids, prisoners in a basement, completely cut off from the world they once knew. For 78 days, they lived in that house under armed guard. 78 days of not knowing if they'd see another sunrise. 78 days of trying to maintain hope while the revolution raged outside their painted-over windows. The guards had literally painted the windows black so the family couldn't see out. Imagine being a teenager, locked away from sunlight, from any connection to the outside world. But here's where this story becomes more than just historical tragedy. It becomes supernatural horror. Because what happened on the night of July 16th, 1918 was so violent, so prolonged, and so unjust that according to numerous witnesses over the past century, those children never truly left that house. The Ipatiev house stood for nearly 60 years after the murders, and during that time, it became notorious among locals. Workers who were assigned there reported hearing children's voices echoing through empty hallways. Night security guards would quit after a single shift, claiming they'd seen small figures moving through the rooms where the family had been kept. Even during the day, people reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness that would wash over them the moment they stepped inside. By the 1970s, the house had become such a source of unease that the Soviet government made a drastic decision. They demolished it entirely, completely. Razed it to the ground in 1977 and hauled away every brick, every piece of wood, every fragment that remained. They wanted to erase the location from existence. But you can't demolish ghosts, can you? What happened next is where this story takes a turn that will send chills down your spine. Because even with the house gone, even with nothing but empty ground where those children had spent their final days, people still reported supernatural encounters at the site. Visitors to the empty lot would suddenly burst into tears without explanation. They'd hear singing, children singing Russian lullabies, floating through the air on windless days. Local Yekaterinburg residents began avoiding the area entirely. Even hardened construction workers refused to work on the site. It wasn't until 2003, 25 years after the demolition, that anything was finally built there again. The Church on the Blood, a memorial to the murdered family. And even now, even with a church standing where the house once was, the reports continue. Today, I'm going to tell you the complete story of what happened in that house, why those children's spirits apparently remain trapped there, and why this might be the most heartbreaking ghost story you'll ever hear. Because unlike most ghost stories, every single detail I'm about to share with you has been historically verified. These children really lived, they really suffered, and according to countless witnesses over the past 105 years, they really never left. So settle in, because we're about to descend into the basement of Russian history, into a story of innocence lost, brutality unimaginable, and spirits that refuse to be silenced. This is the story of the Romanov children, and why their ghostly presence continues to haunt not just a single location, but an entire nation's conscience. Get ready for the most heartbreaking ghost story from Russia you've never heard. To understand why the spirits of the Romanov children might be trapped in such torment, you need to understand what their final days were actually like. Because this wasn't a quick execution, this was 78 days of psychological torture that would break most adults, let alone teenage children. Picture this: you're 17 years old, like Anastasia was. Just a year ago, you were living in a palace with hundreds of servants, attending balls, learning languages with private tutors. Your biggest worry was which dress to wear to dinner. Then, almost overnight, your entire world collapses. Your father, the Tsar, abdicates the throne. Revolution erupts across your country. And suddenly, you're not a princess anymore, you're a prisoner. The Romanov family was moved several times before finally arriving at the Ipatiev house in April 1918. But this wasn't like their previous locations, where they'd at least maintained some semblance of royal treatment. Nikolai Ipatiev, the military engineer who owned the house, was given just 48 hours to evacuate his own home. The Bolsheviks converted it into a fortress prison specifically designed to hold the former imperial family. When the Romanovs arrived, they found their new reality immediately. They were assigned just 4 rooms on the upper floor for the entire family of 7, plus their 4 loyal servants who had chosen to stay with them: Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, the family physician; Anna Demidova, the chambermaid; Ivan Karatonov, the cook; and Alexei Trupp, the valet. 11 people crammed into 4 small rooms. The psychological warfare began immediately. The guards painted over all the windows with white paint so the family couldn't see outside. They removed the family's piano from the dining room and moved it to the guards' quarters, where they would play it loudly at all hours while singing revolutionary songs and drinking. Imagine being a child, lying in bed, listening to men drunkenly singing songs about destroying everything your family represented. The guards deliberately made as much noise as possible. They would stomp through the hallways at night, slam doors, and shout at each other. They scribbled crude political slogans and obscene graffiti on the walls where the family would see them. The lavatory that the family had to use was also used by the guards, who would leave it filthy and covered in more obscene writing. But the cruelest psychological torture was the isolation. The family had no contact with the outside world. No letters, no news, no visitors, except for occasional inspections by Bolshevik officials who would stare at them like animals in a zoo. The children had no idea what was happening to the rest of their extended family, no idea if the civil war was ending, no idea if rescue was coming. For teenage girls like Maria and Anastasia, this was devastating. They'd grown up with busy social lives, surrounded by friends and activity. Now they spend their days in 4 small rooms trying to find ways to pass the endless hours. They read the same books over and over. They played cards with hands that trembled from stress. Anastasia, who had always been the family comedian, became quiet and withdrawn. Little Alexei, just 13 and suffering from hemophilia, had additional challenges. The stress and poor living conditions triggered several bleeding episodes during their captivity. There were days when he was too weak to get out of bed. His sisters would take turns sitting with him, reading to him, trying to keep his spirits up while hiding their own terror. The family tried desperately to maintain some normalcy. They held small birthday celebrations with no gifts and no cake. They conducted their own prayer services since no priest was allowed to visit. Tsar Nicholas would read aloud to the family each evening, though he had to choose his books carefully since the guards monitored everything. The most heartbreaking detail? The children still hoped. Right up until the end, they believed they might be rescued. They believed they might see their friends again, return to their palaces, resume their lives. Anastasia wrote in her diary about things she wanted to do when this is all over. Maria talked about the books she wanted to read when they got back to their library. These children maintained hope even as their world crumbled around them. The guards changed in early July 1918, and the new commandant was Yakov Yurovsky, a hardened Bolshevik who showed no sympathy for the family's plight. Under his command, the psychological pressure intensified. The family was allowed only brief periods in a small enclosed garden, always under heavy guard. Sometimes local Bolsheviks would come just to stare at them during these garden walks, pointing and laughing at the former imperial family. By July 1918, the family had been prisoners for over a year, and the children were showing signs of severe psychological distress. They'd lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and jumped at unexpected sounds. Olga, the eldest at 22, began having anxiety attacks. Tatiana, who had always been the most organized and responsible, became obsessive about small details because it was the only thing she could still control. Food became another form of psychological torture. The family went from elaborate multi-course meals to simple, often spoiled food that barely sustained them. The guards would sometimes forget to bring meals, leaving the family wondering if they were being deliberately starved. When food did arrive, it was often cold or partially eaten by the guards. The children's physical appearance changed dramatically during their captivity. Photos taken shortly before their deaths show gaunt faces and haunted eyes. Anastasia, who had been plump and rosy-cheeked, became thin and pale. Alexei looked years older than his 13 years, the stress and his illness aging him rapidly. Perhaps most cruel of all was the false hope. On July 13th, just 3 days before their murders, the family was told that 2 of their loyal servants had been sent out of this government, suggesting they were being relocated somewhere safer. The children were overjoyed, thinking this meant they too might be moved to better conditions. In reality, those servants had already been shot dead days earlier. This is the psychological state these children were in during their final weeks. Terrified, isolated, clinging to false hope, and completely dependent on each other for emotional survival. They had no idea that their captors had already decided their fate. They went to sleep on July 16th still believing they might see another day, still hoping for rescue, still trying to comfort each other in their family bonds. Understanding this context makes their ghostly presence even more tragic. These weren't just children who died young, these were children who spent their final months in a state of prolonged terror and uncertainty, never knowing safety or peace before their violent end. It's no wonder their spirits might be unable to rest. What happened on the night of July 16th, 1918, was so brutal and chaotic that it took investigators decades to piece together the full timeline. But when you understand exactly how these children died, you'll understand why witnesses claim their screams still echo through the air in Yekaterinburg more than a century later. It was just past midnight when Yakov Yurovsky, the house commandant, knocked on Dr. Botkin's door. The family physician was still awake, writing in his diary, a habit he'd maintained throughout their captivity, though he had no idea his final entry was just hours away. Yurovsky's message was simple but urgent. Wake the family immediately. They needed to dress and gather their belongings because they were being evacuated due to fighting in the city. For the children, this news was a mixture of terror and hope. On one hand, any change after 78 days of captivity felt promising. Maybe this was the rescue they'd been praying for. Maybe they were finally being moved somewhere safer. Anastasia, despite the late hour, was actually excited. Anything had to be better than the claustrophobic nightmare of the Ipatiev house. The family took about 30 minutes to dress and pack. Think about that for a moment. 30 minutes to gather the possessions from what would be the last normal moments of their lives. The girls helped each other with their dresses, unaware that they were dressing for their own funeral. Little Alexei, weak from a recent bleeding episode, needed help getting ready. His father, Nicholas, carried him when he couldn't walk on his own. Here's a detail that makes the story even more heartbreaking. The children had sewn precious gems and jewelry into their clothing over the previous months, not for vanity, but for survival. They'd hidden diamonds, rubies, and other family treasures in the linings of their corsets and undergarments, hoping these valuables might help them if they ever escaped or were released. These hidden gems would play a horrific role in what happened next. At around 1:30 am, Yurovsky led the family down the narrow staircase to the ground floor, then through a double door into the basement. The room they entered was small, only about 16 by 20 feet, with a low ceiling and whitewashed walls. There was one electric light bulb hanging from the ceiling and 2 windows that had been painted over like all the others in the house. The room was completely empty, except for a few chairs. Nicholas asked for chairs for his wife Alexandra and son Alexei, both of whom had difficulty standing for long periods. The rest of the family, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, stood behind their parents along with their 4 loyal servants. Picture this scene. 11 people crowded into a small basement room in the middle of the night, still believing they were about to be evacuated to safety. Yurovsky told them to wait while he prepared their transportation. The family stood there for several minutes in that basement room, probably making quiet conversation, maybe the girls whispering to each other about where they thought they were going. Anastasia might have been making jokes to try to lighten the mood. That was always her way of dealing with stress. Then the door opened again, and this time Yurovsky wasn't alone. He entered with 11 armed men, one for each member of the family and their servants. The moment they saw the armed squad, the family knew there would be no evacuation, no rescue, no tomorrow. Yurovsky read from a piece of paper. The Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. That was it. No trial, no final words, no chance to say goodbye to each other. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What? What?" before Yurovsky shot him point blank in the chest. What happened next was chaos. The confined space, the panic, the number of people, it all contributed to a massacre that was as disorganized as it was brutal. The executioners had been assigned specific targets, but in the confusion and darkness, with gunpowder smoke filling the small room, they began shooting wildly at anyone they could see. But here's where the story takes an even more horrific turn. The bullets weren't killing the children. Remember those hidden gems sewn into their clothing? The diamonds and other precious stones were acting like primitive bulletproof vests, deflecting the shots. The girls were being hit but not dying, just wounded and terrified, screaming and trying to protect each other. Anastasia, who had been standing near the back wall, was struck multiple times but kept moving. The executioners, panicked and confused about why their victims weren't dying, began using the butts of their rifles, then bayonets, then knives. What should have been a quick execution turned into a 20-minute nightmare of violence and terror. Witnesses later reported that the children were crying out for their parents, calling each other's names, trying to help their wounded siblings even as they themselves were dying. Alexei, the 13-year-old heir, survived the initial shooting and was crawling on the floor, moaning and bleeding. Yurovsky had to finish him with 2 shots to the head. Maria and Anastasia survived even longer. Some accounts suggest they were still breathing when the executions began carting the bodies upstairs. One executioner later reported that he heard moaning coming from the truck as they drove away from the house, meaning at least one of the children might have still been alive as they were being transported to their burial site. The brutality didn't end with the deaths. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven 12 miles into the Koptyaki forest. There, the executioners stripped the corpses, discovering the hidden gems that had prolonged the children's agony. The jewelry was ripped from their clothing as their lifeless bodies lay in the forest dirt. The plan was to dump all the bodies down a mine shaft, but the shaft proved too shallow. So the executioners tried a different approach. They doused the bodies with acid and gasoline, attempting to burn them beyond recognition. When that proved only partially successful, they decided to bury most of the family in a shallow grave, but first they selected 2 bodies, likely Maria and Alexei, to burn more completely and bury separately. Think about this. These children's final moments were spent watching their family members die around them, feeling bullets and bayonets tear through their flesh, calling out for help that would never come. Their last conscious thoughts were of pain, terror, and desperation. They died far from sunlight, far from comfort, far from anything resembling peace. The psychological trauma of such a death, particularly for children who had already endured months of imprisonment and fear, creates the perfect conditions for spiritual unrest. In many cultures, violent deaths, especially of the innocent, are believed to trap souls in the location of their trauma. But the horror story doesn't end with their deaths, because what the executioners didn't anticipate was that their botched, brutal murders had created something far more lasting than they intended. They'd created a haunting that would persist for over a century, a spiritual wound in the very fabric of that location that no amount of time, no political changes, and not even complete demolition could heal. The children who died in that basement weren't just victims of political revolution. They became eternal prisoners of the very spot where their young lives ended in terror and agony. The supernatural activity at the Ipatiev house didn't begin immediately after the murders. For the first few years, the house simply stood as a grim monument to what had happened in its basement. But by the early 1920s, something had changed. The building itself seemed to have absorbed the trauma of that July night, and it began to affect everyone who entered. The first documented reports came from the cleaning staff assigned to maintain the house. The Soviet government had converted the building into a museum, ironically calling it the last palace of the last Tsar. Workers would arrive each morning to find furniture moved overnight. Despite the building being locked and guarded, chairs that had been placed in the upper rooms would be found arranged in the basement, as if someone had been trying to recreate the scene of the murders. But it was the sounds that truly terrified people. Night guards reported hearing children's voices echoing through the hallways, not threatening or angry, but plaintive and lost. The voices seemed to come from the basement, but when guards investigated, they found nothing. The most frequently reported sound was crying, soft, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Maria Volkov was a cleaning woman assigned to the house in 1923. She lasted exactly 3 days. Years later, she told a journalist what had driven her away. "On my second day, I was cleaning the upper rooms when I heard someone call Mama from downstairs. It was a child's voice, very faint, very sad. I thought perhaps a visitor had brought their child, though that wasn't allowed. When I went to look, the building was empty except for me. But I could still hear that voice, calling and calling for their mother." The psychological impact on workers became so severe that the Soviet authorities had trouble maintaining staff at the building. People would quit after single shifts, claiming they felt watched, followed, or overwhelmed by an inexplicable sadness the moment they entered the basement area. Then there were the sightings. The first documented appearance of one of the Romanov children occurred in 1925, reported by a night security guard named Viktor Petrov. According to his official report, which was quickly suppressed by Soviet authorities, he encountered a teenage girl in the basement at approximately 2 a.m. She was wearing a white dress and seemed to be searching for something, moving slowly around the room and occasionally kneeling to look under or behind objects that were no longer there. Petrov called out to ask how she had entered the locked building, but when the figure turned toward him, he saw her face clearly and immediately recognized her from newspaper photos as Grand Duchess Anastasia. Her expression, he later told investigators, was one of profound confusion and sadness. She stared at him for several seconds, then simply faded away, as if someone had slowly turned down the brightness on a light bulb. Word of these incidents spread among locals despite government attempts to suppress the stories. Yekaterinburg residents began avoiding the area around the house, especially at night. Those who had to pass by reported feeling an overwhelming sense of grief that would wash over them as they approached the building. Some claimed to see lights moving through the painted-over windows, even though the building had no electricity connected after dark. The phenomena escalated in the 1930s. During Stalin's purges, when the house was being used for various government purposes, workers reported increasingly frequent encounters. A typist named Elena Kozlova filed a complaint with her supervisor in 1936, stating that she could not continue working in the building because the children will not let me concentrate. When pressed for details, she explained that she frequently heard young voices whispering to each other in Russian, though she could never make out the words clearly enough to understand what they were saying. Perhaps the most chilling account from this period comes from Ivan Smirnov, a maintenance worker who was alone in the building one evening in 1938. According to his written statement to the authorities, he was in the basement checking the heating system when he heard what sounded like multiple children talking excitedly among themselves. The voices seemed to be coming from the exact spot where the murders had taken place. As Smirnov listened, the voices became clearer, and he realized they were playing some kind of word game, the sort of thing children might do to pass time when confined to a small space. He could make out individual voices, older girls giving encouragement to younger ones, the sound of gentle laughter. For a moment he found himself smiling, charmed by the innocent game, playing. Then he remembered where he was and what had happened in that room. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was listening to the Romanov children, somehow still trapped in their final prison, still trying to comfort each other and pass the endless time. Smirnov fled the building and never returned to work there. The reports continued through the 1940s and 1950s. Despite changing political climates and official discouragement of such superstitious nonsense, night workers at the building reported tools moving on their own, doors opening and closing without explanation, and the persistent sound of children singing lullabies in Russian. The basement area became particularly active on July 16th each year, the anniversary of the murders. By the 1960s, the building had become so notorious among locals that the Soviet government struggled to find anyone willing to work there overnight. Day workers reported feeling constantly watched, and many complained of headaches and nausea that would disappear the moment they left the building. Several workers reported seeing shadows moving in their peripheral vision, always child-sized, always seeming to dart away when looked at directly. The most persistent haunting involved the sound of footsteps. Multiple witnesses over the decades reported hearing small feet running up and down the staircases, particularly the narrow staircase leading to the basement. The footsteps often sounded playful, as if children were running and chasing each other, until they reached the basement level, where they would always stop abruptly. Dr. Alexei Romanov, a psychiatrist who studied the psychological effects of the building on workers, no relation to the murdered Alexei, conducted interviews with dozens of employees between 1965 and 1970. His unofficial findings, never published due to political pressure, suggested that exposure to the building caused measurable increases in anxiety, depression, and what he termed empathic trauma response, meaning people were somehow absorbing and experiencing the emotional trauma that had occurred in the location decades earlier. By the early 1970s, reports from the Ipatiev house had become so consistent and widespread that even hardened Soviet officials began to take notice. Workers were requesting transfers at unprecedented rates. The building's productivity for any governmental purpose was essentially zero, as people couldn't concentrate or work effectively while inside. Local party officials tried everything to suppress the supernatural activity. They brought in Orthodox priests to bless the building, despite the official atheist stance of the Soviet government. They had psychologists evaluate workers for mental health issues. They even tried completely renovating the interior, hoping that changing the physical environment might eliminate whatever was causing the phenomena. Nothing worked. If anything, the activity seemed to intensify in response to attempts to stop it. It was as if the children's spirits were determined to be acknowledged, to have their story told, to prevent their suffering from being forgotten or erased by political convenience. The final straw came in 1976, when a visiting party official from Moscow experienced his own encounter while touring the building. According to leaked documents, this high-ranking official heard children crying in the basement and saw what he described as translucent figures of young people in formal dress moving through the rooms. His report to Moscow was brief but clear. The building was unsuitable for any governmental purpose due to persistent, unexplained phenomena. 1 year later, in 1977, the Soviet Politburo made their decision. The Ipatiev house would be completely demolished. Not renovated, not repurposed, completely destroyed. Every brick, every board, every piece of metal was to be removed and the ground cleared. They hoped that eliminating the physical location might finally put an end to the supernatural activity that had plagued the building for nearly 60 years. They were wrong. On a cold September night in 1977, the Ipatiev house was reduced to rubble. The demolition was carried out under cover of darkness, without public announcement, as if the Soviet authorities hoped that destroying the building quietly might somehow undo 6 decades of supernatural terror. They were methodical about it. Every brick was hauled away, every piece of wood burned, every fragment of the house removed from the site. By morning, nothing remained but bare earth where Russia's most haunted house had stood. For a brief moment, it seemed like the demolition had worked. The immediate supernatural activity stopped. No more reports of children's voices, no more sightings of figures in white dresses, no more unexplained sounds echoing through empty rooms. The authorities congratulated themselves on finally solving their paranormal problem through brute force and Soviet efficiency. But spirits, it turns out, are not so easily erased. The first reports began just weeks after the demolition. Construction workers brought in to clear the debris noticed something unsettling, an overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. These were hardened men, used to working in all kinds of conditions, but they found themselves inexplicably emotional while working on the site. Several workers reported sudden episodes of grief so intense they had to stop working and leave the area. Mikhail Petrov, a bulldozer operator assigned to level the remaining foundation, later described his experience to local journalist. "I'd been operating heavy machinery for 15 years, seen all kinds of construction sites, but this place was different. The moment I started working on that basement foundation, I felt like I was committing a crime. My hands were shaking, my eyes were tearing up, and I had no idea why. It was like the ground itself was mourning." The emotional impact wasn't limited to workers. Local residents who had to walk past the empty lot reported similar experiences. Elena Kuznetsova, who lived nearby and passed the site daily on her way to work, kept a diary of her experiences. Day 5 after demolition, walked past the empty lot and suddenly started crying uncontrollably. Day 12, heard children singing, though there were no children visible anywhere. Day 18 saw shadows moving across the bare ground, child-sized shadows that shouldn't exist without objects to cast them. By winter of 1977, just months after the demolition, the supernatural phenomena had not only returned, but intensified. Without walls to contain them, the spirits seemed to have spread across a wider area. Residents in buildings near the former house site began reporting paranormal activity in their own homes. Children living in the neighborhood complained of nightmares, featuring sad children in fancy clothes who would visit them in their dreams, asking for help finding their parents. The most chilling reports came from people who had no knowledge of what had happened at the site. Tourists visiting Yekaterinburg would sometimes approach the empty lot and spontaneously burst into tears. A British journalist visiting the city in 1979 wrote, "I was exploring the city centre when I came across a vacant lot that seemed oddly significant. The moment I stepped onto the cleared ground, I was overwhelmed by the most profound sadness I've ever experienced. I found myself sobbing for children I'd never met, mourning a loss I couldn't understand. It wasn't until later that a local resident told me this had been the site of the Ipatiev house." Perhaps most significantly, people began reporting direct encounters with the Romanov children's spirits, not inside a building this time, but manifesting in the open air above the empty lot. These sightings followed a consistent pattern. Witnesses would see translucent figures of young people in early 20th century clothing, always appearing lost and confused, often seeming to search for something they couldn't find. Anna Volkov, a teacher who frequently walked through the area, had multiple encounters between 1978 and 1980. In her detailed account, she described seeing a group of young people, 2 older girls and 2 younger ones, all wearing white dresses. They would appear near sunset, walking slowly across the empty lot, as if looking for a house that was no longer there. When they reached the center of the lot, where I later learned the basement had been, they would stop and seem to realize something was wrong. The confusion and sadness on their faces was heartbreaking. Then they would simply fade away. The Soviet authorities tried to ignore these reports, but by the early 1980s, the supernatural activity around the former Ipatiev house site had become impossible to dismiss. The area had developed a reputation throughout the Soviet Union as a place of unexplained phenomena. People would travel from other cities specifically to visit the site, hoping to witness the paranormal activity for themselves. Local government officials attempted various solutions. They proposed building a parking lot over the site, thinking that concrete might somehow block the spiritual activity. They considered turning the area into a public park, hoping that living plants and normal human activity might restore the location's positive energy. None of these plans came to fruition, partly due to bureaucratic delays, but mostly because construction workers refused to work there after dark, and even day shifts reported disturbing experiences. The phenomena evolved throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Witnesses began reporting not just sightings of the children, but also of their loyal servants who had died alongside them. Dr. Botkin, the family physician, was frequently seen walking across the site, carrying what appeared to be a medical bag as if still trying to tend to his patients. Anna Demidova, the chambermaid, was spotted searching through the empty air, as if looking for belongings that no longer existed. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, restrictions on discussing the supernatural phenomena were lifted and the full scope of the hauntings became public knowledge. Local newspapers began publishing regular accounts of encounters at the site. Television crews visited to document the phenomena, and several captured unexplained audio recordings of children's voices speaking in Russian. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence emerged in 1995, when a sound engineer named Dmitry Volkov recorded what he called impossible audio at the site. Using professional recording equipment, he captured what sounded like multiple children having a conversation in pre-revolutionary Russian dialect. The voices were clear enough that linguists could analyze them, confirming that the speech patterns and vocabulary matched that used by upper-class Russian children in the early 1900s. The most heartbreaking aspect of these ongoing manifestations was their apparent purpose. Unlike typical ghost stories involving vengeful or angry spirits, the Romanov children seemed to be simply trying to continue their interrupted lives. Witnesses reported seeing them playing games, trying to comfort each other, and searching endlessly for their parents. They appeared to be trapped in a perpetual state of confusion and loss, unable to understand why their family had been separated or why their home no longer existed. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the remains of most of the Romanov family were finally given a proper burial in St. Petersburg Cathedral. Many people hope this formal recognition and respectful interment might allow the children's spirits to find peace. The supernatural activity at the Yekaterinburg site did decrease somewhat after the burial, but it never stopped entirely. In 2003, the Russian Orthodox Church completed construction of the Church on the Blood on the exact site where the Ipatiev house had stood. The church was specifically designed as a memorial to the murdered family, with the basement level preserved as a shrine to their memory. Church officials hoped that replacing the site of tragedy with a place of prayer and remembrance might finally put the children's spirits to rest. Today, more than a century after their deaths, reports of supernatural activity continue. Visitors to the Church on the Blood frequently report feeling overwhelming emotions while in the basement memorial area. Some claim to hear whispered prayers in pre-revolutionary Russian. Others report seeing brief glimpses of young figures kneeling in prayer, appearing and disappearing in moments. The children's ghosts seem to have found some measure of peace since the church was built. The desperate, searching quality of earlier encounters has given way to something more contemplative and serene. But they remain. Tour guides at the church quietly acknowledge that unusual experiences are common, particularly on July 16th each year, when the memorial services are held. Perhaps most remarkably, the supernatural phenomena associated with the Romanov children have been reported not just in Yekaterinburg, but in locations around the world where their story is remembered and mourned. Visitors to Romanov memorial sites in Europe and North America have reported similar encounters, always involving children in period dress, always conveying a sense of loss and separation, always appearing to search for family members who cannot be found. The Romanov children's story has become more than just a historical tragedy or a local haunting. It has become a global symbol of innocence destroyed by political violence, and their spirits seem to serve as eternal witnesses to the consequences of unchecked brutality against the helpless. Their ghostly presence continues not as a threat or a warning, but as a reminder that some wounds to the human spirit run so deep that even death cannot heal them. In their eternal searching for family, for home, for the peace they were never allowed to find in life, the Romanov children have become the most heartbreaking ghosts in Russian history, forever young, forever lost, forever calling out for the love and security that was stolen from them in a basement in Yekaterinburg over a century ago. Their story teaches us that the supernatural isn't always about revenge or unfinished business. Sometimes it's simply about love that refuses to die, hope that persists beyond death, and the eternal bonds between family members that not even the most brutal violence can destroy. The Romanov children remain with us still, not as figures of fear, but as eternal symbols of innocence, lost and love that transcends even death itself.